Lodge of Theosophists. As most of you know, the Lodge, U.L.T, is not an organization. We are actually an association of independent students, you could say. And we, from time to time, we gather together in study classes and a talk like tonight in order to discuss our theosophical subjects. And so on every Sunday night we have a talk at 7:30. We have classes on Wednesdays, Fridays, some on Saturdays and Sunday morning. And we have a pamphlet, a monthly pamphlet, in which you find a declaration, which is more or less what binds us together in a sense. We don't have any rules. Everything we do in U.L.T is based on voluntary contribution, time, work, and money, you could say. We don't go around with the hat. And our talk for next week is on Isis Unveiled, HPB's first major opus, you could say. And the talk is Isis Unveiled, Behind Reality and Illusion. That's for next week, Sunday. Our subject for tonight is probably one of the most simple subjects in theosophy, on the monad. I'm being facetious here. But it shouldn't be too difficult. And so we have a handout. We don't need to finish the whole handout, of course. And as usual, everything we say and what we discuss together is an attempt to understand the philosophy better. And in truth, when we look at the literature that we have, which is primarily based on H.P. Blavatsky's work and William Cohen Judge, whenever we look through it, people have a tendency, of course, to look for answers, because we all come with questions in this philosophy. And we hope to find answers. And you will find some answers. But don't expect ultimate answers. Because whatever answer that you will find is always a new stepping stone to further horizons. And so what we say here as individual students has to be regarded as trying to help each other in a sense. And it's not cut in stone, as they say. We're all students. We don't have any teachers or gurus here. Our teacher itself is the message that has been given by HPB. And nobody is held to run away with whatever is being said or whatever you find in our literature. And in a sense, we could even say that when we look at the theosophical teachings, that ultimately you won't even find an answer, but you will find subjects and material, substance in fact, to ponder. And the way that we progress in that is, of course, very steadily. Don't imagine that, oh well, we can do a few courses at U.L.T because we don't have any courses, we don't have any diplomas. It is a continuous research and investigation, primarily within ourselves. Because what we can do as U.L.T is provide people with information. We do not provide them with understanding, for the simple reason that understanding is something that comes from within. Of course, what we can do is try and present the information in a congruent way, and in a way that becomes something that is used by whoever listens to it, and then finds that understanding within himself. But we know very often people say, oh, what you explain now, I understand it. Well, we didn't make you understand anything. The understanding came from within. Information comes from without. And in that sense, another element that comes into play in the study of theosophy is that HPB points that out with regard to the Secret Doctrine, her major work written in 1888, where she says the Secret Doctrine has not been written to develop the intellect in man, which in itself is a strange statement, because if you look at the literal Latin translation of intellect, it means understanding. But it has acquired a different connotation in our modern society, we could say. And she says the Secret Doctrine has been written to develop the intuition in man, which means actually our inner understanding. So what we're dealing with students in the study and in how we communicate that with each other, we obviously fall back on concepts. And HPB in page 3 in volume 1, in the footnote on page 3 in volume 1 of the Secret Doctrine, she says there that we do not apologize for being conceptualists, as against Rossellini's realism and nominalism. Nominalism is not the same as nominalism. Nominalism means that you see the reality in the names that you give to things. And realism is the fact that whatever you perceive, that's real. All the rest is just abstraction or something made up by the mind. And HPB obviously disagrees with it, because she says through concepts we come closer and closer, and we can, as it were, build up a conceptual approach of something in such a way that intuition can strike as lightning. And that's what we're trying to do with our study. So our subject for tonight is the monad. And the monad, literally, monad, in Greek, monas, means the one. And Pythagoras called it the monas monadum. And of course, a word like one can also mean unity, because one is unity after all. It's not a number one as distinct from number two. So you can also say the only. So the monas monadum means literally the one and only. And as we see here on page 1, the first thing that is said from most of our references are from the Secret Doctrine. The Greek monas signifies unity in its primary sense. And here's that famous statement from the Secret Doctrine. Those unable to seize the difference between the monad, the universal unit, and the monads, or the manifested unity, as also between the ever-hidden and revealed logos, or the word, ought never to meddle in philosophy, let alone the esoteric sciences. And of course that is a warning to all of us. And when we think of the monad, what that actually is, we have a tendency to look for things as being real. And HPV points out in the Secret Doctrine that the more abstract something is, the more real it is. The more subjective it is, the more real. And you can even prove that to some extent, even on our physical plane. Say you bump your knee into a chair, and it hurts, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and then it's over. But your friend steps in and said, well, you know what you said yesterday night to the people there, that was really crappy. You know, you're a bad guy or something. But you can carry that along for years to come, if necessary. So we see that something more abstract, because it's psychological, it's less concrete than bumping your knee into a chair. It carries a lot more weight. And we see that throughout history as well. Ideas carry much further than the immediate things that happen around us. Think of war. It's almost like a universal archetype, you could say, because we carry the ideas of war for centuries and centuries. We keep rehashing and, as it were, reacting to it again. So the monad itself is a very abstract concept, you could say, but in essence it is a reality of existence itself. It is that what carries existence. And existence itself is in the true sense substance. It is in a certain sense material, if you like, no matter how subjective that material might be. And existence comes from the Latin word existere, to come out. It comes out of that which was hidden before. That is what existence is. So in Theosophy, as also in Platonism, the idea is that everything that exists has to already exist in potentiality. And that is what ultimately the monad is. The whole of manifestation, before it manifests, the whole of the universe, before it manifests, already exists in potentiality. And that means that everything is in fact one, a unity. And we see that even science is forced to some extent to look for an ultimate source. They call it the Big Bang. And of course that is from a very material perspective, although we see now that also in science they need to go to concepts that become more and more abstract. Because now they're asking questions, well, what happened 2 billionth of a second before the Big Bang? And obviously we're dealing there with very abstract ideas. They realize that more and more. And in that sense, you could say that even, especially theoretical physicists, become more philosophers than objective scientists, because they're dealing with things that are very, very subjective. So the monad means one, but it can have many meanings. When we look throughout our literature, we will see that the idea of the monad is dealt with in different ways. Nevertheless, no matter how it is dealt with, it is always a center of spiritual potentiality. I wouldn't even say consciousness, because consciousness is again a word that is the cause for a lot of misunderstanding and misconception in our world, because for some people consciousness means the capacity to move or the capacity to think, for instance, where it is more like a potentiality. You could say consciousness per se in a sense, which is sometimes used, but sometimes we use consciousness also for the content of mind, our thoughts. That's what consciousness represents. And sometimes we see that consciousness is also used for the vehicle, mind, through which those thoughts manifest themselves. So here with the word consciousness, we already have a problem. So to say that the monad then is consciousness per se, you can do that, but perhaps it would be better if you see it as infinite potentiality. And that is also the very essence of our being. We are so used to seeing ourselves as manifested bodies that we very often identify with the body. Very few people can think of themselves as existing without a body. We need a torso, 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head on it. And that's us. But then the question arises, well, is there something that is real in us that doesn't change? Because look at your body. There's a big difference between a 5-year-old, a 50-year-old, and a 90-year-old. And then people say, okay, well, I may not be my body, but at least I have to be what I think. But then look at how our thoughts change. How we sometimes even change political associations. Some people start maybe out as a communist and end ultimately as a capitalist. And still they're the same person making the change, or the one who's witnesses whatever they're doing. So we're obviously not our thoughts either. And then people say, well, okay, but then I must be my feelings. Well, I can't think of anybody who has never ever changed his feelings. And we change them perhaps more often than we do our thoughts. So the question remains then, what are we in essence? And that is what is actually referred to by the monad. That is what we truly are. We are an absolute abstraction. That is the reality of our being. And we use the word being by lack of something better, because we ought to say it's the essence of our non-being. And of course then, what is it in us then that evolves? And what evolves in us are the potentialities that exist within the monad. The monad itself, like we said, is infinite potentiality. That is the true essence of our being. But once, in order to have experience, infinite potentiality cannot experience something unless it develops vehicles through which experience becomes possible. And that's when such elements like feelings and thoughts and bodies come into play. But they just don't appear out of nothing. So therefore we know we have something as involution or an evolution. And both make up the whole idea of evolution and in its totality in Theosophy. But according to Theosophy, if you look at science, for instance, science starts from a sort of 0 point. Ultimately with the Big Bang, of course. And ultimately we have this little bowl of mud that we call Earth, and then there's life there, and that starts again from a sort of 0 point. And ultimately we get this hopefully infinite evolution. Although we all know that sooner or later there's going to be an end to this Earth. And no matter how much we have evolved, it will be destroyed. So if existence is truly only a material fact, then there is actually no hope and no need to do anything at all, because ultimately it will all end, no matter how far we evolve. But if we are infinite potentiality, that gives a totally different color to the idea of evolution. Because before true evolution can take place, we need an involution. And that means that vehicles need to be developed in order to make experience possible. And once that those vehicles are sufficiently evolved to make self-consciousness possible, then through self-devised and self-induced efforts, we can finally start with true evolution. And that is the position in which humanity finds itself right now. The monad has evolved its inner potentialities to such an extent that we are where we find ourselves today. And that is still far from the end of all evolution. Because the ultimate end means actually that we return back to our own infinite potentiality with the added experience of the past cycles of evolution, so to speak. And so when we say that anything that manifests, anything that can exist, has to come out, in a certain sense, from the monad. And that means that the monad itself, besides having that potentiality, well, or let's put it differently. If you look at existence generally, we can, from even the Platonic and even from a Christian perspective, throughout the last 2,000 years, we have made major divisions in how we look at things. And we usually approach them from the perspective of spirit, soul, and body. Those three elements are present in us in different degrees. Well, that potentiality exists within the monad. So the monad has the potentiality of manifesting, the potentiality to move, the potentiality to grow, the potentiality to change. It also has the potentiality to evolve a vehicle through which that change can take place. And it also has the potentiality to evolve very material vehicles that makes life on this plane possible. So in that sense, we could say the potentiality to think exists also in the monad. The potentiality to differentiate. And so those three ideas of spirit, soul, and body can also be represented by what we call in Theosophy Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. So that potentiality of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas exists in the monad before any kind of manifestation. But then it exists not objectively, but potentially within the unmanifested monad. So the first thing that manifests then are those three potentialities of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. And that's what makes it so difficult to understand the monad. Because sometimes the HPB uses the monad as this, as the Pythagorean monad, that which exists before anything manifests, the absolute infinite unit or potentiality of everything. But then the first thing that manifests is spirit, you could say. That's like Mr. Judge says, the first manifestation in space is spirit, or the potentiality to move. That is often also referred to as the monad. And that is then the manifested monad, you could say. Manifested unity. And then HBB also refers to the monad sometimes as a duo, Atma and Buddha, which means spirit and matter. That's also an approach for monad. Or she approaches the monad in its fully manifested potentiality, which is that of Atma Buddhi Manas. You will find that in volume 1, 570. We have it here in the reference too, where she says that Atma Buddhi Manas is eternal and immortal. And yet she can speak of duat and of a monad per se. But those are just simply different stages of development. So the monad per se, that potentiality of motion in its manifested condition, lies at the basis of everything that manifests. Even the bad things we do are possible through that potentiality to move. If we move in the wrong direction, that is still due to that capacity, but the direction itself has not been chosen by the monad. That has been chosen by our mind, of course. But nevertheless, the potentiality to make choices exists within us, and we can choose wrongly in that sense. So, in that sense, all the manifested monads then are very often looked upon as individual rays. But so the universal, the Pythagorean, unmanifested monad, if we make a correspondence, we can look upon it as the sun, for instance. The sun is one. And the sun has many rays, millions of rays. But has any one of you ever seen one single ray? We see light around us, and we conceptualize it as many rays. And yet nobody has ever seen a single ray. And therefore HPB says, well, the ray, the monadic ray, does not individualize until a certain level of evolution has been reached. And that is where manas kicks in, the potentiality to think within the monad. When that manifests, then the monad is individualized, of course. But that's only our perception of it. So, if we look at page 1, the second reference from the bottom, the paragraph, the tendency towards segregation, clear that the monadic essence begins to imperceptibly differentiate towards individual consciousness in the vegetable kingdom. Of course, that doesn't mean that vegetables have self-consciousness, Lord forbid, or that even animals, have self-consciousness, but they have consciousness. If we define consciousness as the capacity to move, well, there is even motion in the minerals. We all know that when certain chemical elements are combined, you get all kinds of chemical phenomena. So that means that there is some intelligence present in there that knows what to do. Of course, what it does is always the same. You can bet on it that will usually do the same thing. But nevertheless, it is intelligence working through that kind of vehicle, we could say, which is the intelligence of the monad itself. And so, when we look at the mineral kingdom, whether we speak of gold in South Africa or gold anywhere else, gold per se as an element is identical everywhere in the world. Salt is identical everywhere in the world if we're talking about the same salt or silver. And of course there can be impurities, but those are already combinations of elements. The pure element that exists in the mineral kingdom is the same everywhere. And that's why she also can refer to the fact, I think she did that in the third paragraph here. In the third paragraph, she said here on page 1, in short, as the spiritual monad is one, universal, boundless and impartite, whose rays nevertheless form what we, in our ignorance, call the individual monads of men, so the mineral monad, being at the opposite point of the circle, is also one. And from it proceed the countless physical atoms which science is beginning to regard as individualized. So the intelligence that works through the mineral kingdom is one intelligence, we could say. And then within that one intelligence, you have subdivisions of hierarchies that manifest as different substances, you could say. Now, what we see then in the vegetable kingdom is that the potentiality to move becomes more pronounced, at least on the surface of it. A tree has roots. Most vegetables still have roots, but we see something growing. It's not so obvious in the mineral kingdom, although we know some in the mineral kingdom are elements of growth. We know that too. Think of certain crystals that truly grow. Why do they grow? Well, because there is intelligence in it that is a little bit more developed than in other elements that do not grow, for instance. But in the vegetable kingdom, it becomes more pronounced, but vegetables are still rooted in the ground. The next step up, we see a further step of what you could say, the freeing up of consciousness of its limitations of being rooted in the ground, and then we call them animals. But they still cannot make choices. Or if an animal makes choice, then it is an instinctual choice. And you can almost bet on it that the choice will always be pretty much the same. And you could say the need of the animal kingdom is also relatively very basic. But at the same time, we see that it is a very highly developed intelligence. You don't need to teach animals anything from when they're small. They almost immediately do what they need to do. The little bird that comes out of the egg, the mother doesn't sit there and gives it a course for 3 days in how to fly. It gives it some time until it has a certain reached a certain development. And then there is this instinctual knowledge, you could say, almost an animal intuition, if you like. It kicks it out of the nest, and either it flies or it don't fly. And the same with fish and anything else we can imagine. And just look at ourselves. If we compare humanity with the animal kingdom on that level, our babies are totally hopeless. It takes quite a while. We have to teach babies all kinds of things. We have to teach them how to walk. If you don't learn a baby how to walk, it'll walk on all fours for the rest of its life if you don't take measures. And so, in that sense, you could say, from a purely physical perspective, the lower kingdoms do what they have to do. But that's the thing, they will always do the same thing, no matter how intelligent it may look. Whereas humanity has the capacity to make choices. But then we have another problem. You can't make that choice without self-consciousness. So the self-consciousness that is present in us is the manifestation of the capacity to take responsibility, which is a capacity that resides also in the monad, which is that infinite potentiality. And so once that we have that capacity to make choices, the problem is you can make the wrong choice. And that is the predicament that humanity finds itself in nowadays, that we make the wrong choices. So there are certain prerequisites, we could say, in order for the potentialities that reside within our monadic essence to come to full bloom. We need to educate ourselves. We need to learn. And for that, we have our theosophical material, we could say. Now, the question, of course, is that is the monad just that infinite potentiality? It looks kind of cold almost. We could say, well, it has nothing human in it. Well, it does have something human in it, or the human would never be able to manifest out of it. But it sounds kind of cold, just like this metaphysical abstraction. And yet at the same time, HPB refers to it as a being as well. Just take another look at a very good example of that. Oh, here it is. It's actually the bottom one of page 1. Colin, would you mind reading that? The thread between the silent watcher?
The thread between the silent watcher and his shadow, man, becomes stronger with every reincarnation. Is another psychological mystery. The watcher and his shadow, the latter numbering as many as there are reincarnations for the monad, are one. The watcher, or the divine prototype, is at the upper rung of the ladder of being, the shadow at the lower. With all the monad of every living being, unless his moral turpitude breaks the connection and runs loose and astray into the lunar path, to use the occult expression, is an individual Dian Chohan, distinct from others, a kind of spiritual individuality of its own during one special mandantara. Its primary, the spirit, Atman, is one, of course, with Para-Atman, the universal spirit. But the vehicle, or Vahan, is enshrined in. The Buddhi is part and parcel of that Dian Chohani essence. And it is in this that it lies the mystery of that ubiquity, which was discussed a few pages back. My Father that is in heaven and I are one, says the Christian scripture. In this, at any rate, it is the faithful echo of the esoteric tenet.
Thank you. So that's quite an interesting line there. The monad of every living being is an individual Dian Chohan, distinct from others. A kind of spiritual individuality of its own during one special mandantara. That gives us immediately a completely different perspective on the monad from just being a sort of a cold abstraction. Because that Dian Chohan is a being that has evolved in previous cycles of existence and has developed to quite a very high level of intelligence. And that Dian Chohan is here equated with the monad, of course the manifested monad, because she also says that once those monads are reabsorbed into the oversoul, it's just like when the drops return to the ocean, you could say. They identify not with their individual selves anymore, but with that ocean, at least if they have reached the ability to do so. Otherwise, they are just reabsorbed without knowing that they are reabsorbed. Just like what happens to us every night when we go to sleep. We are absorbed in our own very essence without realizing that we're absorbed. When we wake up, there is no recollection of it. Usually we have dreams, which is an intermediate state. So one of the purposes of meditation, for instance, is to try and penetrate during the night into that deep sleep in a self-conscious way, so that we can bring it back to our daily lower monastic consciousness. Do you find it surprising to see that the monad here is equated with an individual Dian Chohan?
Yes.
Well, look at not the next paragraph on page 2, but the third one, the sons of wisdom. Vicky, would you mind reading that?
Page 3?
Page 2.
Page 2.
Right in the middle, the sons of
The
wisdom.
sons of wisdom, or the spiritual Dianas, had become intellectual through their contact with matter because they have already reached during previous cycles of incarnation that degree of intellect which enabled them to become independent and self-conscious entities on this plane of matter. They were reborn only by reason of karmic effects. They entered those who were ready and became the arhats, the sages alluded to above. This needs explanation. It does not mean that monads entered forms in which other monads already were. They were essences, intelligences, and conscious spirits, entities seeking to become still more conscious by uniting with more developed matter. Their essence was too pure to be distinct from the universal essence. But their egos, or manas, since they are called manasa, putra, foreign, maha, or lodge, had to pass the earthly human experiences to become all-wise and be able to start on the returning ascending cycle. The monads are not discrete principles, limited or conditioned, but raised from that one universal, absolute principle. The entrance into a dark room with the same aperture of one ray of sunlight following another will not constitute two rays, but one ray intensified. It is not in the course of natural law that man should become a perfect septenary being before the seventh race of the seventh round. Yet he has all these principles latent in him from his birth. Nor is it part of the evolutionary law that the fifth principle, manus, should receive its complete development before the fifth round. All such prematurely developed intellects on the spiritual plane in our race are abnormal. They are those whom we call the fifth rounders. Even in the coming seventh race at the close of this fourth round, while our four lower principles will be fully developed, that of manus will be only proportionally so. This limitation, however, refers solely to the spiritual development. The intellectual on the physical plane is reached during the fourth root race.
Thank you. So what we see here is the philosophical problem of how something universal becomes individualized. And the problem lies actually more in our understanding or the conceptualization of what an individual is. Because universal means the one that turns upon itself, universe, turning up the one, uni, verse, turning upon itself. Whereas if you look at the root, the root meaning of the word individual also comes from the Latin root individus, indivisible. So the distinction between the universal and the individual is just a matter of how we look at it. Because the individual, if it means individus, then in a certain sense it's the same as the universal. Because the idea in Theosophy is that every being, and you could say in a sense, every monad consists of lesser developed monads, or just call it then lesser developed potentialities, with the emphasis on developed, not on potentiality, because the monad on whatever plane, infinite potentiality on whatever plane is identical. And potentiality in itself is not something that evolves. What evolves is the ability that comes out of that potentiality. But you can't add anything to potentiality per se. Absolute potentiality, there's nothing to add to it. It's everything. And you can't take anything away from it because it's not a thing from which you can remove something. So from our perspective, it's an absolute abstraction. But those potentialities exist in different degrees of substance. And that is what makes the difference. Because what they can evolve in any kind of degree of substance, the potentiality they can evolve is limited by the degree of substance to which they belong and in which they develop. Now, that's not rocket science, right? I mean, homogeneous substance is not some degree of substance that sits there to be homogeneous. Homogeneous substance, if it is truly infinite and boundless, that means that homogeneous substance exists in an infinite amount of degrees as well, but in a homogeneous manner, you could say. So in other words, to us, homogeneous is that which to us is imperceptible. To beings on that particular plane of homogeneousness, to them that may already be differentiated substance, is homogeneous to us. And you look at in the literature how often HPB says when she explains something to us from our perspective. She uses that very often because she's trying to explain virtually everything in the Secret Doctrine from our perspective. So how do we come then from something universal to something individual? Well, it's simply a matter or a way of how we look at things. everything in the manifested universe is relative from your perspective. Is a house big or small? Well, if there would be only one house in the whole universe or on this planet, you can't say that it's a big house or a small house until you put another house next to it. And then you have something to compare. So in itself, the things are not relative, but they are relative in comparison to something else. And now you can apply the same to the idea, is something important? Is whatever we do, is that important? In itself, nothing whatsoever that we do is important. But it's important relative to something else, to another goal or plan that we have, or something that we want to establish. So in the manifested universe, except for the monad, infinite absolute potentiality, once you step away from that, you end up in relativity. Everything in the manifested universe is relative. And that is the idea here too, that every intelligent being that has that in its very essence, that infinite potentiality consists of lesser developed beings. Just look at yourself, just even your physical body. It's not a homogeneous unit. I mean, it consists, the fact that it can exist is because of innumerable entities, living beings that exist within our body. We know now, science has come so far to realize that we contain about 10 times more bacteria than cells in our body. Well, take all those bacteria away from your body and you won't exist anymore. Take the bacteria out of your intestinal tract and you'll die pretty much instantly. You poison yourself. So we find viruses and microbes and minuscule microscopic lives throughout our whole body. And even in that sense, Theosophy looks at a molecule or a cell as a living entity because it is a living intelligence. But just like the atom, you could say, at least the traditional vision is that the atom has a center, a nucleus of protons and neutrons with electrons around. But we know that the protons and neutrons consist, oddly enough, each one of them, of 3 quarks. That's a triad. It's esoterically speaking kind of interesting that there's a triad in each proton and neutron. And so you can divide things up as long as you have something, whether you call it substance or energy, you can always divide it further. As long as you have a thing and the means to divide it, then you have 2 things. And then you have again 2 things that you can divide ad infinitum. But in the other direction it's the same. Many atoms together make a molecule. Many molecules together make a cell. Many cells together make an organ. Each one is an intelligent entity in Theosophy that itself consists of lesser developed intelligences and is with others part of a higher developed intelligence. And that goes on ad infinitum virtually in both directions, whether small or big. Once we go beyond what we call our manifested universe, we don't know where we end up, even on the physical plane. We have a solar system with planets. That solar system with the planets is, you could say, in a sense, a monad, a unit, of which what we see are only parts, of course. But it is a potentiality. That potentiality consists with other solar systems in a larger universe, which you may perhaps call a zodiacal system. That system with other systems ultimately makes a galaxy. Then we see that there are clusters of galaxies. And even science calls it that way. Islands of galaxies. And then you have clusters of islands of galaxies. And you have clusters of clusters. And so forth. Until the mind reels and is exhausted and our telescopes can't see it anymore. And so what do we say? Well, that's the end of space. Because that's as far as we can see. But it may very well be that the end of space is just an island with other islands that are infinitely large almost. So in that sense you could say in an infinite universe, in an infinite space, size is really of no consequence. It doesn't really matter because it's all relative to our perspective. Do we have any questions so far on what we've been discussing? Because the handout itself, you better read this at home. It's interesting. But
you mentioned the E. coli in the intestinal tract. We know quite well when the baby first comes into the world, its intestinal tract is devoid of E. coli. Where do they come from?
No, you're going to give me the answer. I don't know where they come from. And where do they come from, Joe?
I would suspect what Mr. Judge openly hinted in the ocean, that what we call bacteria, he calls the lives. And it appears that these E. coli represent the lives. You mentioned that we can't get along without them. Many of the bacteria in the gut are noxious once they get outside the gut. And we know quite well that the ones we call E. coli and many of the other so-called named bacteria are absolutely necessary for carrying on, helping with digestion.
And there, through your example, we see that every being has its own, what you call, environment in which it properly exists. And it only becomes dangerous because when the same activity expressed in a different environment, like for instance when certain bacteria penetrate the intestinal wall, then on the outside they may do a lot of damage because that's not their environment to work in. And very often they even change their face, so to speak, and science looks upon them as different microscopic life. But it's actually the same thing in a different environment. And sometimes it even changes its appearance. So that to science it gives the impression of being something else. But it's actually the same thing in their own environment. So that's a good example. And HPB points out that microbes and bacteria on our plane are actually precipitated or crystallized prana from a higher plane. So where do then the E. coli come from in the baby? From crystallized prana in that sense. Vicky, did you have your hand up there? No? Okay.
I could, but Kelly really knows.
Okay, Kelly?
You say that from the infinite potentiality to the individual, that happens because of karma.
Does that happen because of karma? Yeah, truly, because infinite potentiality also is the capacity to act. It is the capacity to move. Once you have movement, you have action. Once you have action, you have causes. Once you have causes, you have effects. So the monad itself, in fact, which sometimes is also referred to as Atma, or sometimes Anu, Adam, sometimes it's referred to as Hiranyagarbha, even an egg, because that's an atom. That in itself is the source of karma, or the law of karma. It's not karma itself, or in the sense you could say it is karma itself as the law, but karma in operation is when those potentialities act, when they manifest themselves, then we have the law of karma in operation. So the monad is the source of karma. And that karma, you could say it also, that potentiality also contains the acquired experiences of previous manifestations. But there is always a residue to it. And it is that residue that wakes up again. Just like when we die, the residue, what we call our skandhas, our tendencies, will reappear in a new incarnation. Eva?
Can we train our mind and heart in such a way that we will be able to perceive the universal and the individual as one and the same?
Can we train our mind to such an extent?
And heart,
Or a heart?
Mind and
in
heart.
a sense, the heart is another word for mind, a higher mind at least. But I would certainly say so. I think it's perhaps, we can call it training, but in reality it is more of an awareness, becoming aware of it. But we become aware through experience, and that takes time. So I would certainly think so. What do you guys think?
no idea.
Yeah.
But I wanted to raise another point that, in a sense, goes along with this point. From what you described, the entire, what we call the universe, everything, is monadic in essence. We as humans are experiencing we might call a condensed form of that monadic essence, but all of the qualities are latent in everything else. The qualities of mind, of awareness, of compassion, that we recognize as specifically human attributes, but they're there latent. So it would stand to reason then that there are beings beyond the human who are still monadic but are experiencing even higher aspects. We assume that's true. So when you look at the continuum you've described, the microbes, all the different aspects of the physical, could you perhaps say a little bit more about the non-physical aspects and then what could be latent in us that will develop on higher planes?
What do you mean by non-physical aspects in terms of principle?
I was thinking in terms of what was said at the very beginning about the Shohanic essence. And by Shohanic, that really means that which is beyond the human. It's still a creative, an abstract creative force that is not uniquely human, among other things. So thinking of all that one, from the microbe to the human to the beyond force as one, we might call it perhaps a giant monad we're all part of.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of aspects to it that are unknown to us.
That's an interesting point that you bring up, because Theosophy teaches that there is actually fundamentally only three types of beings in the universe. That is, those beings who have not reached the human stage, then beings in the human stage of development, and beings beyond the human stage of development. Or you could say beings that are not self-conscious yet, beings that are self-conscious, mind we should say, because man means mind, and beings that are beyond our human self-consciousness, and in other words, they are universally self-conscious. They are still individualized beings when manifested, but they have already in the past gone through those human experiences that we are going through now. And there is like almost an infinite gradation of hierarchies. I think Mr. Judge makes a comment somewhere that the variety and differentiation within the spiritual world is even much more complex than in our manifested physical world. But that is a matter of perspective, of course, of how you look at it. But so there are beings that are already developed past our human present condition, you could say. But it is then those beings themselves that initiate a new evolution. That's why we say in Theosophy, because they represent the universal, because they are that universal self-consciousness. And in fact, there is nothing but self-consciousness in a sense, because being conscious of self means one, the monad in that sense. There's only self-consciousness, but to the degree that you are conscious of it, that is a matter of evolution. And that starts as it were from zero, like minerals. They're not self-conscious in the way we think of self-consciousness, but they are self-consciousness per se, but not conscious of themselves in the sense of being separate from others. So there's actually only one consciousness, whether you call it universal or individual. In essence, it's the same. It's just a matter of perspective. But it is those universal beings that have gone beyond the human stage that initiate a new cycle of development and then emanate out of their own essence, out of their own monadic essence, the monads that develop on lower degrees of substance, you could say. Our problem is that we have a linear perspective at that, and in reality there is no such thing as time, of course. There is duration, and duration does not mean that no processes are involved. Duration knows processes, but we combine a process with a linear movement through time. There are processes that take place instantly, you could say, all at the same time, but that is sort of beyond the scope of our perception with our present mind. Because the past doesn't exist. That's nothing but a memory. It has never existed. It is only a memory. We are now, and now we are now, and now we are now, always. The future is just wishful thinking. It doesn't exist. We don't know what it's going to bring. So we are always now in duration. But remembering something from a previous now, so to speak, is what we experience as a memory, and then we say the past. But there's actually no time. Everything is, in that sense. But our experience of it on this plane gives us the impression of being involved in a linear sequence. And of course it's true from our perspective. That's just like saying everything that is not the absolute is an illusion. Yep, that may very well be true, until you run with your face in the door, and then you'll have a different perspective on it. Because in order to do so on this plane, you need a vehicle that belongs to this plane of illusion. And that's what we are dealing with. So everything is relative in that sense. I mean, it may be an illusion, but like Rob often says, it is a real illusion. That's why things can hurt or be pleasant.
The past is extremely important. For that reason, it is very real. For the very same fact that we did experience it. And the future is not just an illusion. It's actually very real for what we see coming, or at least we should see coming, which is what we don't see. Mm-hmm. And that's actually the problem of the human being, that doesn't see the future, But the future is very real in relation to our past and present.
Your question is thinking of the future important? Well, of course it is important. But there is a difference between being aware of what the future may bring and conjuring something up that has no reality. A lot of people think, oh, if only this and only that, and tomorrow I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And they never get around to it anyway, because they conjure up all kinds of stories, so to speak, in the monkey mind that can go anywhere. Wishful thinking. Oh, I wish I was this, I wish I was that, but they never act on it. But being aware of you can, in that sense, prepare for the future. There's nothing wrong with preparing for the future. But that has more to do with the awareness now than just wishful thinking about the future. There's a big difference there, of course. So I wouldn't recommend or think even that Theosophy says you shouldn't think about the future. That's not what it means, of course. Yeah, you can think about the future. You can contemplate through awareness where you want to go. But just making up stories about the future, that's a totally different thing. It's just fantasy, in fact. We fantasize about the future. And it's actually important in such a sense that we can never become something or something that we want to establish without the awareness of setting out the lines in our mind how we will come to certain results. You have to see the result, as it were, in a mental frame of what you want to reach in order to be able to reach it. A fantasy cannot be reached because there's no path to the fantasy. But it can become a reality if you set out a future path that you will follow every time in the now. Does that make sense? Jerome, before you
do you think that as we get older, there's a tendency to fantasize about the past?
Oh, fantasizing about the past. Well, yeah.
We're thinking about the past.
Usually the past is represented by a memory. But yeah, we can fantasize about the past too, in the sense of if I only had done this or that. That's a fantasy about the past, but we're doing it now, and you're not going to change it anymore, of course, because it never existed. It's a memory of past nows. Did you have your hand up?
I did.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm not quite sure how I want to put it together in the form of a question. First, I think I should say that it would seem that the bases for both potentiality and potential would be the monads. The question is this: is everything possible represented by monads, and are the monads and their potential and potentialities always abstract?
I would think that potentialities are always abstract, yeah. But in that sense, say we together here, when we are focused upon the subject, in a sense we form a monad, a unity. And that has potentiality. But that potentiality transcends the presence of ourselves as bodies here. We're not the monad in terms of bodies coming together. We're the monad in terms of the unity that we form. And that seems like an abstraction, but it's actually a reality. Because without the aggregate of minds here, we would not be able to discuss what we're discussing, unless I'm sitting here alone, being a lonely monad. So monad means unity in whatever aggregate of entities that come together. That's also an approach of the monadic potentiality. So in that sense, a lodge represents a monad, or should represent a monad. A logos, because the word lodge is also related to the word logos, but the logos is another word for monad in that sense. And we know that there are three logi, the first, the second, and the third. Each one a monad on its own plane, containing all the potentialities of the previous existing monad, you could say.
Then rational thought would lead us to the conclusion that anything important in existence and out of existence is monadic.
Yeah, that's a way of looking at it, sure. Yeah. Another word for monad would be universe. Anything that forms a unit forms a universe, because it's something that turns upon itself. It is contemplating itself, so to speak. So there are many other words. As long as we don't see the monad as a thing, you know, it's the abstraction, the noumenon of a thing, you could say. The thing is already the objective manifestation of that potentiality. Jerome?
The now is all we have, isn't it?
The now, yeah, the now is all we have. But that's also at the same time everything. It's not a limitation. It is the all. So in that sense, the understanding of what a monad is not that difficult. It is just infinite potentiality. But once we want to grasp it, we limit it. And then it's not the monad anymore, the one. Because once you can grasp it, it's something, an object relative to another object. Jerome?
The now is beyond conception, isn't it?
Is the now beyond conception? I would certainly think so, because once you conceptualize it, you have time. Mm-hmm. Concepts usually take place in time, at least on our plane.
And yet, part of being human is experiencing, living in the moment. Because our tendency always is to either live in the past, or anticipating something. Now, we are in a sense of balance between those three states. But to truly be aware of what's around us at this moment is requires some sort of concentration and focus. And also, we might think of respect for what's around us. So we're not dominating it or denying it, but accepting that it's a universe that isn't just about us. And I think that's very hard work.
Yeah, it's an increased awareness. In other words, becoming more conscious of. And how do you do that? Well, by starting to learn to pay attention to things. The more we think about ourselves, the less that awareness increases for some reason. We have that experience too when you watch a movie or you're very much focused on something that happens on TV or a work that you're doing, and you're not thinking about yourself. There is no concept of time anymore. Yet mechanical time moves, of course. But the consciousness time, the psychological impact of time is gone until you become aware of yourself. And then there's the limitation again. Because time is a limitation. Duration is unlimited. It sounds kind of odd and the opposite, but it's not true. Joe?
Martin Luther in the SD says that which impels evolution is monad and, of course, personality and its equivalent. And Mr. Judge says in his big important article, the higher keynotes to evolution are karma and reincarnation. How would you verbalize this relationship if you had to do it in a formula, verbal formula?
And what do you want me to verbalize?
The impelling of evolution by the monad. And Mr. Judge's statement that the keynotes to higher evolution, karma and reincarnation.
Well, does anybody else have a suggestion?
Well, karma is pushing us towards human brotherhood. The more you look at it, the more you realize that somehow in karmic law, there's some kind of tendency to push us in the direction of human brotherhood.
Well, yeah, since it is part and parcel of that infinite, boundless potentiality, it wants to return to its own source, which is by definition brotherhood. So it is in search of itself, you could say. And unfortunately, in its manifestation, through the different beings that are emanated, it stumbles along. The problem of those potentialities when they manifest is that the consciousness that expresses that potentiality, in order to manifest, needs a physical vehicle to manifest through. And then there is immediately the tendency to identify with its perception. That's the reason we think we are our body, our thoughts, and our feelings. And so being able to slowly divest ourselves from that attachment is what will truly set us free in the future. Eva?
Could one say that karma is absolute reality and reincarnation is relative reality?
Is karma, well, as a law, it is absolute reality. Yeah, sure. It's an aspect of absolute reality. And reincarnation is the temporary expression of that reality. But then we perceive it as an illusion, of course. But don't forget that everything we perceive in the world is in fact real. Our perception of it is the illusion. Because HPB says, well, fundamentally, neither consciousness nor substance, we should say, not matter, but substance, changes. It is eternally itself. But it is the interaction between the two that changes. And that is what we refer to as form. So even matter doesn't change. The things that we call matter here is actually a form of substance. See? That is the result of sensory perception. if you would drop that sensory perception, that forms the veil, then we would truly see things as they truly are. HPB explains that brilliantly in The Secret Doctrine, in Volume 1, page 329. There she says, matter ought to be applied to the aggregate of objects of possible perception. In other words, it's what I see, what I hear, that impression, the data that comes in through limited sensory, how would you call that? Like almost measuring instruments. Our senses are like measuring instruments. They have a limit as to their range. We can only see so much of light. We can only hear so much of sound. We can only feel so much of touch and so forth. And so the perception of our world is a limited perception. Because if you would see it with what you would call infinite senses, then nothing would be as it is now, of course. Or even with extended senses. Imagine you would be able with your eyes to see X-rays like Superman. The world would be looking totally, completely different from what it is now. So what we're seeing is a veil. And we take that for real, and that's form. And therefore she says it's better to use the word substance for that which carries that reality, that consciousness. That's what it literally means. Substance means to stand below or to carry consciousness. That's what substance means. The perception of it, she says, is what we call matter, but that's actually form and an illusion. It's a temporary appearance. Well, you have one minute left to speak your mind as to the moment. Do you think it was difficult, this subject? Of course, it is a vast range of subjects, the monad. That's the strange thing with the study of Theosophy. Once you focus on a particular subject, and you take any book almost, especially the Secret Doctrine, every page has to do with that subject on which you focus your awareness. It's as if the whole Secret Doctrine is about the monad, and then you focus on reincarnation, and the whole Secret Doctrine is about reincarnation, or about karma, or about the Anibuddhas, or whatever you want to call it. Every page contains everything, which is again proof that everything exists within everything.
I think the hardest thing about the monad is realizing, as you point out, and as the quotes obviously point out, that it's not a thing. Because he uses name, the monad. You think of it as a thing, like the chair.
Yeah.
So to think of it as a function, an aspect of the absolute, the manifestation is a very different way.
Well, that which is absolute, the only thing that it can do when it manifests is show its infinite potentiality that exists within it. What else is there to do? And what would be the need for just having the existence of potentiality without its expression? There would be no need for an absolute. But once it exists, well, then it has to manifest. But once it manifests, it's a limitation of its original potentialities. And that is what the monad is, infinite potentiality and unity. All right, sorry friends, we're already over time a few minutes. Thank you. So next week, the subject will be on Isis unveiled, behind reality and illusion.